Welcome to this section covering the conclusion and next part of the course. In this section, we're going to take a look at the conclusion on building a scalable serverless microservice data API and talk about the next course. Welcome to this video that concludes this part of the course of the series on serverless microservices. The purpose of this part of the course was to introduce you to building a scalable serverless microservice data API using practical examples where I've shared my personal experience of running a serverless stack in production. In this video, we will recap on what was covered in the course. So basically summarizing the steps involved in building a scalable serverless microservice data API. In section 1, we looked at the monolithic and microservice architecture. Rather than having you read many architecture books, watch many courses, and read numerous blog posts, in this section I've summarized the important principles and concepts. In this section particularly, we've looked at the monolithic and multi-tier architectures, the monolithic service-oriented architecture, and microservices, and looked at the benefits and drawbacks of both. If you remember on the right, a microservice application is composed of a small suite of services, each running its own process and communicating with lightweight mechanisms, often HTTP or HTTPS as an API, and often with its own local data store. In addition, they would publish these specific events to other services that are listening. In section 2, we looked at the AWS building blocks for creating serverless microservices. In this section, I introduced you to different infrastructures for hosting and running microservices, with a specific focus on the serverless computing. We first talked about virtual machines, containers, and serverless computing, and then the serverless computing managed services within AWS. And then we talked about setting up the environment within AWS. So for example, we've given you all the tools for understanding what Lambda functions are and various use cases, such as a serverless file transformer. When we were setting up the AWS environment, we created an AWS account, provided an overview of the AWS Management Console, and also, in order to ensure that your environment is secure, we created a new user with specific permissions and also the multi-factor authentication. In addition, we set you up using the AWS command line interface as well as Boto3, which is the Python SDK that you've used. And we've included explaining how the credentials work. In section 3, we talked about securing your microservice. I shared my practical experience, content from security white papers and blog post information. Again, the idea is to save you time on making sure that your serverless microservices are secure. I provided an overview of the AWS security, why security is important. Think about it, especially nowadays when it's not just financial loss, but also the loss of client, consumer, and reputation that are at stake if your enterprise is breached or data is lost, for example. We also talked about the types of security and the shared AWS security responsibility model that you should implement within your organization. We then talked about the AWS Identity and Access Management, or IAM, especially giving details around the policies, roles, groups, and users. And finally, we talked about securing your serverless microservice. That includes the Lambda security, API gateway security, DynamoDB security, and also the importance around monitoring and alerting. In section 4, I talked about creating your first serverless microservice. In this section, I provided you with all the configuration and source code you need to create your first fully functional scalable microservice data API. We specifically talked about building the data API using a Lambda function and then connecting that to DynamoDB to actually read the data, as well as connecting it on the other end to an event source, which was the Amazon API gateway. This allows you to create a fully serverless microservice stack using those managed services within AWS. In section 5, we talked about testing your serverless microservice. In this section, I shared my experience on running various types of tests that are required for a production-grade serverless stack deployment. I've shown you how to test your code and give you the tools to develop and debug locally, allowing you to write quality code. I've also shown you how to run your own load testing on the newly created Serverless Data API. In this section, I shared my experience on building and deploying your serverless stack in a repeatable and predictable way. I provided an overview of the different options in order to deploy your serverless stack. We created an S3 bucket, IAM policy, and IAM roles for the actual serverless stack to function, and I showed you how to deploy this using SAM, which allows you to deploy your stack in a repeatable and consistent way. Well done on completing this part of the course. You now have a solid understanding of serverless microservices, and more importantly, practical experience at creating, securing, testing, and deploying your serverless stack. You should be really proud and ready to start building your own serverless microservice.